Here's Johnny!
There is a particular kind of silence that falls over a room when Jack Nicholson walks in, and it has nothing to do with fear, though some of that exists too. It is the silence of an entire room recognizing all at once that the most unpredictable and genuinely alive person in the building has just arrived. For more than 50 years, that presence defined American cinema, and the grin, the raised eyebrow, the barely contained wildness behind the eyes, none of it was performance. It was the real man leaking through the role, and audiences felt it every single time. But here is what the interviews never showed, what the acceptance speeches carefully avoided, and what the mythology of one of Hollywood's last true legends was always designed to conceal. Behind that grin lived a man with a code, so specific and so deeply personal that when the people around him violated it, even accidentally, the damage never fully healed. 6 people crossed that line. 6 names Jack Nicholson carried long after the films wrapped, the awards got collected, and the applause dissolved into nothing. These are not stories about grudges, because they are something far more revealing than that. They are the story of what it actually costs to care about something completely in a profession that has always rewarded people for caring about nothing at all. To understand why certain partnerships broke Jack Nicholson, you first need to understand what he believed acting existed for. Most people in Hollywood treat acting as a craft, a discipline without question, but ultimately a job you arrive at, perform, and collect payment for when it ends. Nicholson never operated that way. Acting, in his view, was the most honest thing a human being could do in front of another human being. A form of truth-telling that required vulnerability, required danger, and above all, required a partner willing to leap into the unknown beside you with no safety net underneath either of you. A great scene was never built in advance. Discovery happened in the moment, and the only path to discovery was walking into a scene with total commitment and zero guarantees about what would come out the other side. Marlon Brando was not simply an actor Nicholson respected, and calling him an influence barely scratches the surface. Brando was the reason Nicholson became an actor at all, the North Star of his entire artistic life. And from the very beginning, Jack studied the man the way theologians study sacred texts, with reverence and the unshakable conviction that Brando had unlocked something true about human experience that most performers would spend their whole lives chasing. When the Missouri breaks finally brought them together in 1976, Nicholson did not simply show up to a film set. He arrived on a pilgrimage, prepared and focused and hungry, in a way that only a man meeting his greatest teacher can be. What he found instead was a man who had stopped caring entirely. Brando refused to memorize his lines, had cue cards taped to furniture and door frames and even to the bodies of crew members standing just outside the frame, invented accents mid-scene with no connection to any character in the story, and drifted in and out of engagement as though the entire production were a minor inconvenience. Some people on set read it as eccentric genius, and that interpretation was available and perhaps even convenient. But Nicholson, standing directly across from the man he had built his entire artistic identity around, felt something closer to watching someone set fire to everything they had once helped construct. For weeks, he held on to the image of who Brando had been, tried to find the genius underneath the indifference, tried to convince himself there was still something sacred at work. None of that held. The truth was that Brando was not pushing boundaries at all. The effort was simply gone. Nicholson said later that genius does not excuse laziness, and that a lazy genius is nothing more than an elaborate fraud, and those words carried no malice inside them. They were a eulogy for a belief he had carried his entire adult life. The film failed, the dream dissolved, and what remained was the knowledge, unwanted and permanent, that the person he had shaped himself around had stopped caring about the very thing that once made him extraordinary. Shelley Duvall delivered a wound of an entirely different shape, and understanding it requires separating what Nicholson felt during filming from what he understood years afterward. Where Brando had been indifferent, Duvall was overwhelmed, and where Brando had simply stopped trying, she was drowning in a situation that demanded far more than any person should ever be asked to give. The Shining in 1980 was not a film set by any ordinary definition. Under Stanley Kubrick's direction, It functioned as a psychological pressure chamber, with Duvall bearing the full weight of it in ways Nicholson could not clearly see while it was happening around him. Kubrick pushed his cast through dozens of takes, sometimes hundreds, grinding down every defense until raw exposed emotion was all that remained, and Nicholson could survive that environment because he thrived on exactly that kind of pressure. Duvall came apart under it, and what registered to Nicholson as inconsistency and unreliability was in reality a human being fighting to remain intact under conditions that had no justification. He needed a partner who could match his rhythm, and instead found himself carrying the emotional weight of two-person scenes entirely alone. He compared it to dancing with someone listening to entirely different music. The frustration was real. And yet years later, with the clarity that distance provides, Nicholson went back to that experience and revised his understanding completely. Duvall had not failed him. Kubrick had failed her. The trembling and the visible terror he had once read as unreliability were all evidence of a person being pushed past every boundary that should ever surround an artist, and he called what she endured unconscionable. Tom Cruise arrived as a different kind of problem, and the challenge he presented was not born from weakness or suffering, but from something closer to its opposite. By the time A Few Good Men went into production in 1992, Cruise had assembled himself into something so polished and precisely constructed that Nicholson found working against it almost unsettling. Talent was not the issue. The issue was what that talent had been shaped into, because every movement was calibrated, every emotional beat set in place before the camera rolled, and no crack existed in the surface where something unplanned could breathe. Nicholson described looking into Cruise's eyes during a scene and seeing the machinery working, and for him, that was the opposite of what acting was supposed to feel like. The famous courtroom confrontation looked electric from every seat in the theater, and it was electric, because Nicholson poured everything he had into it and hurled his energy at Cruise like a direct challenge, trying to crack through the perfection and find something wild and unguarded underneath. A studio recording came back every time, flawless and immovable, when what Nicholson needed was the unpredictability of something live. No animosity grew between them, and Nicholson respected the discipline openly. But he believed with every cell in his body that real art required the willingness to fall apart in front of millions of people, and Cruise had built himself too carefully for that kind of collapse to ever be possible. Faye Dunaway stands apart from every other name on this list, because what she damaged was not a performance or a professional relationship, but something Nicholson had been nurturing for years before a single frame was shot. Stepping into The Two Jakes meant stepping into the role of director and guardian of a story he had carried close to his heart since Chinatown had cemented his place in cinema history. Reuniting with Dunaway seemed like a homecoming, because their chemistry in that earlier film had been the kind of pairing audiences experience as something real rather than constructed. The woman who walked onto that set was not the collaborator he remembered. She arrived late, questioned every line, and pushed back against every directorial decision with a force that held nothing generous inside it. These were not creative disagreements born from passion for the material. They were battles, and each one chipped away at Nicholson's ability to hold the vision together, while he was already carrying the weight of functioning as both actor and director on a project loaded with expectation. In one heated moment, the words came out before he could measure them, telling her directly that what was happening between them was not collaboration, but sabotage. That word, once spoken, could not be pulled back. The film failed to connect with critics or audiences, and the failure landed as something personal in the way that only the destruction of a long-held dream can manage to be. Nicholson never directed another film after The Two Jakes, not because the skill or the passion had left him, but because the wound ran deep enough that he would not risk reopening it. Sean Penn appeared in Nicholson's life at a moment when Jack was searching for creative renewal, and The Pledge in 2001 seemed like the right vehicle to restore what the previous years had taken from him. Penn, as a director, was someone Nicholson genuinely respected, because an actor directing another actor suggested a shared language. That assumption dissolved quickly. Penn directed with a level of control Nicholson had rarely encountered, measuring every pause, dictating every glance, assigning meaning to every breath before a take began, and for an actor whose entire power came from not knowing what was coming next, That level of grip was not structure. It was suffocation. Nicholson later asked what the point was of hiring him if all a director wanted was a puppet, and the question carried real pain underneath the words. The performance Penn needed was delivered, because professionalism was never something Nicholson abandoned, but walking away from that production he described feeling hollow, as though the work existed, but its soul had been quietly removed somewhere during the process. Penn was not cruel, and his vision was entirely sincere, but it had no room for wandering, and Nicholson had spent his entire career building a craft that was nothing but wandering toward the truth. Leonardo DiCaprio was not an adversary and never became one, and that is part of what made The Departed in 2006 register as something more unsettling than a straightforward conflict. DiCaprio held up a mirror, and what Nicholson saw reflected was a version of Hollywood he could recognize but could no longer fully inhabit. Representing a generation shaped by intensive preparation and deep psychological research, DiCaprio brought months of immersion in his character before a single frame was exposed and the dedication was real. But that dedication had constructed walls so carefully built that no unplanned moment could penetrate them. During one of their most charged shared scenes, Nicholson produced a real gun without warning, and the genuine fear that crossed DiCaprio's face was raw and unscripted in a way no rehearsal could have manufactured. Scorsese kept rolling, and Nicholson felt the surge of exactly what he had always believed acting was supposed to produce. DiCaprio experienced the same moment as a breach of collaborative trust because his process required control, not emotional ambush, and both men were right according to the philosophies they had each spent years building. The film won Best Picture, and Nicholson acknowledged DiCaprio's talent without reservation, calling him one of the hardest working actors he had ever shared a set with. And yet walking away from that production, the victory carried a hollow note, because what the experience confirmed was that the wildness Nicholson had devoted his life to was being replaced, quietly and perhaps inevitably, by something safer and more controlled. Taken together, these 6 stories do not build the portrait of a difficult man. They build the portrait of a man who cared about something so completely that its violation, in any form, registered as a physical injury that stayed. Brando broke the code through indifference. Duvall struggled beneath a weight she never should have carried. Cruise perfected the surface and never opened the door. Dunaway dismantled a dream from the inside. Penn confined him until his instincts had nowhere to go. DiCaprio showed him a future where danger had been politely retired. Every one of those experiences revealed what mattered to him at the deepest level, because he never demanded admiration, never needed obedience, never required that people perform on his terms. What he sought across 50 years of cinema was authenticity, the understanding that a scene should feel alive, that a partner should be genuinely present, and that a film should be built on trust rather than ego or fear. When any part of that foundation cracked, the wound was real because the work had always been real to him in a way it simply was not real to everyone else. In an era built around carefully managed images and performances engineered for guaranteed approval, there is something worth holding on to in that kind of passionate and costly devotion to the truth of a single scene. Jack Nicholson may have walked away from partnerships that another man might have navigated more carefully, but he never once stopped believing that a great performance should feel like something on fire, like something that could break apart at any moment, like something dangerously and unmistakably alive. And in a world that has always found it easier to reward the opposite of that, his refusal to compromise is not a flaw in his legacy. It is the entire foundation of it.